All right, so this video is on doing an analysis of a poem using a process called Tpcastt. So it's just the acronym Tpcastt, and it's a way of going through a poem in a more systematic process. I'm going to suggest that you take some notes in the reading section of your binder or notebook, and I'll not ask you to memorize the Tpcastt process. You can always use your notes so you can kind of remember what Tpcastt is. So definitely worth your while to take some notes in the reading section of your binder or your notebook. As always, feel free to stop the video whenever you need to. So the question is, how do you analyze a poem? And in the past, you've probably gone through and looked for different literary devices, and you try to see if you can kind of pick out the meaning that the author is getting at with the poem. Tpcastt is just a process to help you organize that analysis of the poetry. So any poem, you can kind of go through the Tpcastt process, and it's a way of then having some understanding, hopefully a deeper understanding of what the author intends. The Advanced Placement Board, the AP board, suggests this process for analyzing a poem when you're in AP literature. So it's a nice prep for that, and it's just a good solid process. You have the vocabulary for doing a literary analysis. You know all the lit devices now, so we'll put those to work during the Tpcastt process. So T is for title. At first, you want to analyze what the title is. What predictions do you have about the poem based on the title? So you just write down your predictions. What do you think this poem is about? We'll reflect on the title again after we've read the poem, but we just want to have some idea going in. What are we expecting from the poem? Not all poems have titles. The first line of the poem is the title, but for most poems, there's some kind of title, and usually there's some meaning behind that title, and it's good to have some predictions. The next step is often omitted by students, but it's definitely the most important. It's not part of the analysis. You just need to read the poem. So as in everything with this class, sometimes you just have to have a first read just to get the gist. So read the poem. Don't look for any literary devices. Don't look for any symbolism. Just read the poem. See what it's about. See what you're getting yourself into. Just stop and read the poem. Then we get back to Tpcastt. The P is for paraphrase. So remember, paraphrasing is just putting something into your own words. So after reading the poem, just rewrite it in your own words. Don't rewrite every line. Don't rewrite every single idea. But just if you were going to give me a summary of the poem, what is it about? If you were just going to tell me, what is this poem about? What's the gist of the poem? In a sentence or two or three, you just write down that paraphrase. Now, if the poem is particularly long, you might do a paraphrase for different stanzas or chunks, maybe 3 or 4 stanzas together. But for most poems, they're pretty short. You could just do a couple of sentences, and this lets you check and see if you have an understanding of the poem. Do you kind of get what it's about? As with everything in literature, it's all up to interpretation, but it's your interpretation. So do you have some idea of what the poem's about? And if you really don't know, you're going to go back and read it again, and then you're going to come and ask me for a little bit of help. P is for paraphrase. The C is for connotation. Now, this is a slightly different way to use the word connotation than from what we learned in the previous video with lit devices. Remember that connotation, when we think about connotation versus denotation, connotation is the feeling or the emotion that we get from the words we read. And now we're analyzing how the author uses language. So what's the emotion that we get from the language use that the author has? So that's how we're going to view connotation in terms of Tpcastt. So you're going to be analyzing the figures of speech or the literary devices and the sound effects of the poem, like do they use alliteration and assonance and consonants. To the right are the poetry literary devices that we've defined. I realize that there are a couple that I added to the previous video that aren't on this list. Any lit device is open to interpretation, and what you're going to do in terms of your analysis is you're going to list the literary devices that you found, and then the examples, so the phrases or the lines or the words from the poem that show those different literary devices. Or you can just annotate the lit devices that you see directly on the poem. Most students prefer to do that because then they can actually see them in context within the poem. Other people like to list them out. It really doesn't matter. But you're looking with connotation to see how the author uses language in the poem to help hopefully get to some deeper meaning. A is for attitude. Attitude is just like tone. So that's the attitude that the speaker or the writer has toward the subject of the poem. So if the author is writing about his child, is the writer excited because their child is born? Or if the writer's writing about the loss of a pet, is she really sad that she lost her pet? So basically, what emotion does the author have about the subject of the poem? So you have to figure out what the poem's actually about, like what is the subject, and then how does the author feel about that? that. I've just listed some adjectives here on the screen, but you really anything is open there for tone. What kind of emotion does the author have? Now, what you need to determine then is what lines or phrases from the poem help you determine the attitude, and that can be tough because you can read an entire poem and you're like, it just feels like the author is really excited and happy about this. But then you can't just use the whole poem as your evidence. So you have to think about what words or phrases or lines really specifically lead you to that. So that's where your analysis comes in. S is for shift. So if there is a change or a shift in time, maybe the poem starts at the beginning of day and ends at the end of the day, or maybe the poem starts at the beginning of the subject's life and ends at the end of the subject's life. Whenever there's a shift in time, or if there's a shift in tone, maybe the author starts out really happy and excited, and then the poem ends really sad and depressed, or maybe there's a shift in speaker. Maybe we go from one narrator at the beginning of the poem to another narrator in the middle of the poem to then back to the original narrator at the end of the poem. Whenever there are any of these kinds of shifts, that should be noted because it's going to affect the meaning of the poem. There is not always a shift. There are plenty of poems where there is no shift in time, tone, or speaker, but you want to be aware of it if there is. If there's a shift in time, tone, or speaker, that has to be important. There has to be a reason why the author chose to do that, and that would add to the meaning of the poem. Then we come back to two T's at the end of Tpcastt. The T at the end, the first T is for title. At this time, you want to reconsider the title, where you write about your predictions. Sometimes you are, and sometimes you aren't. What other meanings might the title have in light of your analysis? So what does the title really mean? And then finally, the last T is for theme. So now you already know what theme is. So it's the general insight into life conveyed by the author through his or her work. So basically, it's the big idea of the piece. Why did the author write the piece? What's the lesson? What's the moral? What's the big idea that we can apply to our own lives? Remember that one word does not make a theme. Love, sadness, peace, those are just theme ideas. That's not a theme statement. So I'm going to ask in your analysis that you write a theme statement. So that's one sentence that states an idea that is true to life and true to your own personal life, something we could apply to our own lives. So something we see in the poem that we can also apply to our own lives. And all of that together is then fodder for your analysis of the poem. So once you have the Tpcastt process completed, you can then provide an analysis of the poem. That might be a paragraph talking about the deeper meanings that you see in the poem. It could be a class discussion. It could be answering questions in class, any number of things. But Tpcastt is that process of systematically going through a poem to gain deeper meaning that then you can use in any of your assignments.